Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will begin the webinar in about 2 minutes at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. This session will be recorded and made available on the ESI events page at www.ncesi.org, and that will be put into chat as well for you. Again, we'll begin in about 2 minutes. Thanks again. And again, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Don Burke with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Stewardship Initiative, and I will be your moderator today. I want to welcome you to today's webinar on Understanding Carbon Emissions Reporting, the New Belgium Journey. Today's Environmental Stewardship Initiative, or ESI, and Waste Reduction Partner, or WRP, collaboration on the greenhouse gas webinar will include an introduction to greenhouse gas emission reporting for industry and industry motivators for carbon reduction efforts. You will hear how the New Belgium Brewing launched a carbon accounting effort over a decade ago, which led to a carbon neutral certification of their fat tire product. Our presenters and panelists today will include Dr. Jeremy Perry and Sarah Frazier, and I will introduce them a bit more in a moment. Also collaborating with this webinar is Terry Albrecht, Section Chief for Waste Reduction Partners and the Land of Sky Regional Council, and we'd like to thank them for hosting this webinar on GoToWebinar. And again, this is a collaborative effort by Waste Reduction Partners, Environmental Stewardship Initiative, and Land of Sky Regional Council. We'll have your contact information up for you in a bit. Now, just a few housekeeping items before we dig into today's topic. If you have audio issues and are using the audio through your computer, you can switch to your telephone. Just go to the audio tab in the webinar controls box, whoops, sorry about that, and click phone. A phone number and code will then be shown for you to use to access the webinar. The call-in webinar information is also in your webinar invite email. We are recording today's session, as I mentioned. The link for the recording and the presentation slides will be posted to the ESI events website for everyone to access. And I'm going to send that to everyone right now. Again, that's at www.ncesi.org. Just give us a few days to get that posted, as well as the webinar materials as well. You may be able to use that freely. So, to ask a question or provide a comment, we encourage you to submit those through the questions box at any time today. After the presentation, the remaining time will be dedicated to your questions. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with our program, the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, or ESI, we are a voluntary assistance and recognition program. It has been part of the North Carolina Department of Environment and Quality since 2002. And yes, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. ESI is administered by the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service, otherwise known as DEACS. We are partially funded by an EPA pollution prevention grant and promote environmental management systems to assist organizations in their efforts to continually improve their environmental footprints. We also encourage and facilitate networking and training events that allow for peer sharing between our members on a wide range of environmental topics. If you are not yet a member and are located in North Carolina and would like more information, please email us. Our contact information is there on the slide, so you can see in the far bottom left corner. We will be happy to share more information with you and answer any questions that you might have. There is no cost to join, and all we ask is an annual report on the progress made towards your environmental goals. As you can see in the upper right hand on the slide, you can access our website at, guess what, www.ncesi.org. And here's a fun splash screen showing many of our members. We'd love for you to be on the slide if you are not already. Again, many thanks to Terry Albrecht, Section Chief of WRP, and the Waste Reduction Partners for assisting ESI staff by providing our outreach today via the GoTo webinar, and also their partners, the Land of Scholar Regional Council. WRP and ESI are both part of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, which has a mission to support pollution prevention strategies, waste reduction, and energy reductions. Terry's contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to him for more insight to the program. You'll be hearing more from Terry during this webinar. And now we are pleased to have the following presenters and panelists with us today for Understanding Carbon Emissions Reporting, the New Belgium Journey. Our first presenter today is Dr. Jeremy Perry, who has been working in the business and environmental field for 20 years as a practitioner and educator. He has worked with many industries and their environmental programs, including air and water programs, hazardous waste, energy and climate concerns, occupational therapy, and process improvement. He has also been teaching throughout much of this time, including at Thomas College in Maine and Duke University here in North Carolina, where he is focused on sustainable business management and risk minimization through collaboration. Dr. Perry, I will pass the baton off to you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. We've had a few interesting things going on with the phones. Of course, that happens when these things get going, but I'm so pleased to be here. I'm here today to introduce Sarah and New Belgium's journey, and I'm really excited about that because I've been working minimally at this point with Sarah on her efforts, as well as some other breweries up in Maine, where I am currently. And I'm really excited about being able to be part of this because it's been a really interesting journey. This carbon dynamic is one that I wanted to introduce a little bit before we get to Sarah's talk, because of the fact that it's really come a long ways. And when I got into the field back in 2000, 20 plus years ago now, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, working with some of these companies here with a corporate experience of working with food manufacturers and boat builders, and in the biotech sector in particular, and now doing some consulting in the textile industry, amongst others. It's really interesting to see how this dynamic is changing, and it's changing very, very quickly. At the same time, I don't think that it has to be a complete mystery as far as what we're trying to accomplish here with regard to carbon emissions, and Deeks has some great programming to try to help you as well. We can go to the next slide. I don't know if I can control that or not. There we go, perfect. So just a little bit about Carbon 101, and there's been some great data that's been coming out of late from the Environmental Protection Agency. Their website and the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership is a really good one. That's one to earmark and take a look at. They do a really nice job of updating things. So there's my plug on the EPA side. Again, the federal level is changing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But at the same time, there's a wealth of information for all different sizes of emitters, whether you're a low emitter or you have many, many thousands of emissions, whether you're regulated in a space or just trying to think about, should I start to recognize what this is all about? So carbon, or greenhouse gases, GHGs, are gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. And we're not going to go into a ton of the science, but it's really important to recognize that this is why we're experiencing warming over time, and why we hear every year essentially that we're having this warming take place. And it's a phenomena that's taking place based on natural elements as well as man-made dynamics. we can see when we talk about emissions from those man-made perspectives that carbon dioxide in particular is the majority in that space at 79%. But we also have other elements that are of concern in this GHG perspective, including methane at 11%, nitrous oxide at 7%, and fluorinated gases like HCFCs from refrigeration, amongst others, at 3%. Because carbon dioxide is the largest dynamic here, we tend to think about this in terms of carbon emissions. And that's the placeholder, if you will, for these four major dynamics that EPA has been looking at for some time, certainly since I got into the field back in 2000. Carbon dioxide is a primary greenhouse gas that's emitted through these activities, and so we're going to focus on that throughout the rest of this webinar. All right, next slide. So carbon management, there's a lot of words on this page. I believe you'll be getting the slides according to Dawn, so that'll be wonderful. And I know this is recorded as well. There's a couple different drivers that are going on in terms of how we manage things. And my work at Thomas and Duke have focused on the idea of how do you operationalize sustainability and carbon in particular. There's really three major dynamics if we think about this from the perspective of the triple bottom line or ESG dynamics that you might have heard of. The first is the environmental reason, to identify emission hotspots, potential reduction strategies as well with your operations for environmental sake, if you will. The second, and I link these two together, are more on the business and social side, where we can start to think about this in terms of, especially if you're not regulated, transparency, identifying areas of inefficiency, mitigating potential risks, especially with regard to our investment community, participating in markets or voluntary programs if you're excited about doing these types of things, as well as our marketing efforts. In terms of carbon versus energy, when I started in this field, we weren't talking about carbon as much as we were talking about energy reduction. And so I wanted to just speak to this a little bit in terms of where this differentiation is. They definitely get tied together nowadays in many spaces, but carbon management in particular is really, at this point, especially in the United States, not regulated. And so we don't have the direct savings to the bottom line that we see with energy savings. So if you do a lighting retrofit project or something with regard to whatever it might be that's using energy in your particular facilities, there's direct savings that you can identify through different meters, through different programs that they now have working directly with those that provide your energy. And the carbon dynamic is starting to come into that conversation, but only within the last few years. But if you do participate in the global market to any extent, we're now seeing that throughout the value chain, or if you have products within your supply chain that come from other countries, you may be subject to carbon taxes or emission trading schemes that, again, you need to be paying attention to in this management space. Okay, next slide. With this in mind, we can think about how we're going to keep track of these. And there's three different dynamics that are playing out predominantly at this point. And they have been identified as Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are those that are direct emissions. They're those that are associated with your combustion at your facility within your boilers or your furnaces, as well as your vehicle. So it's what you're actually using physically, if you will, within Scope 1. Then we have Scope 2, and Scope 2 are the indirect emissions. So they're not the ones that we're producing at our point source, if you will, if we kind of think about the regulatory environment that I'm most used to from my past. Here we're talking more about electricity and steam, cooling for air conditioning, especially down south, not in Maine so much, but there is some of that, where we think about this in terms of what are we purchasing from. So that purchase is really the key word here. And that purchasing dynamic, depending on where it's coming from, can make your emissions obviously go up or down, depending on the management you take in that space. Lastly, and most difficult, is Scope 3 emissions. Many facilities are just, even in the largest companies, starting to figure out what are my Scope 3 emissions. And these are the activities themselves that are not owned, not controlled, that you're not purchasing, and that are impacted within your value chain. So there's an indirect impact here that's really important to recognize with Scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 directly identified by you as the organization, whereas Scope 3 are all those other elements within a value chain that have elements up to and including what your customers use, how they use your product, and what the impact might be with regard to greenhouse gases or carbon in particular. Now, with those Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, there's different protocols. The classic is from the World Resources Institute. It's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And here, we really can see this as the master, if you will. And especially for those of you that are larger emitters, this is the space where you might be playing at this particular time if you are reporting at this time. The protocol is something that came out many, many years ago. I started playing with it back in the early 2000s and has just been growing over time with different iterations and different standards, if you will, that we'll look at in one quick second. If you're a smaller organization or you're a governmental organization, maybe a nonprofit, ICLEI, the acronym here, really is a smaller tool that is not as in-depth, but it's a great tool that I've used many times working with different governments in my past. And then lastly, although linking to these particular protocols, B Lab through the B Corp element is starting to come up with ways to report and account for your carbon emissions as well. These are just a few. There are many others out there also where you can start to play in this space. But I just wanted you to see that there's different breadths in terms of how deep you might want to get with regard to your carbon accounting. All right. So to that end, as far as a deep dive goes, the EPA, again, has some great tools, one of which is this carbon equivalencies calculator. You can go to this tool on the EPA website, look up again their greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator, and do a transition with regard to the different types of sources that you might have, especially within Scope 1 and 2. This allows you to get a kind of a handle on what your calculated emissions might look like. So I wanted to make sure that we saw this today because it's a great tool that I use with a lot of firms when I do consulting to start the journey down this carbon perspective. Sarah's going to be talking about the tool that she's been utilizing. It goes into more depth, certainly, than this does, but this can provide an opportunity for you to get a high-level look, especially if you haven't done this before, at what this might look like for all greenhouse gases, not just carbon. One of the elements that has to happen is that there are these equivalencies, so we need to recognize that whether it's methane or a HCFC, these types of chemicals and compounds have higher impact on the environment than carbon. And so we need to make the calculation so that when you're looking at your total emissions, it comes out as an equal number. And so if you were to be putting out more methane, you're going to have a higher impact, if you will, than if you would only be emitting carbon dioxide. So this is just a great tool that I wanted you to be thinking about on the front end of perhaps your journey with carbon. Next slide. So this is a continuation of that last slide, and EPA is great through the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership. And on that site, there are some tools you can look to help you do some of these equivalencies. Once you get your feet wet, you'll probably realize very quickly that there are a lot of different elements here that you need to keep track of. And I just took a snapshot here of an Excel file that EPA has on its website, and I'd love to help any of you. Certainly, if you need help in this space, my email it will be attached in a couple of different spaces here for you to be able to contact me or my team at Duke or Thomas. But really thinking about this through the idea of what are my impacts and how do we think about the equivalencies and the factors to associate in when I'm looking at my carbon accounting. This tool looks at not just vehicles, but it also looks at multiple factors within Scope 1, 2, and 3 for emission factors to be able to keep track of. And it really breaks things down very nicely. You can see it's a very in-depth perspective here. And I just wanted you to make you aware that there are some tools out there to really help you get your hands around carbon. So again, it does not have to be a mystery. All right. And my background is not just in management, but it's also in legal perspectives as well. So I just wanted to walk us through kind of where we've come, because it's a very interesting space. In 1990, electric power firms started beginning reporting carbon under the Clean Air Act rules, large emitters in particular, throughout the country. Then we had a major gap until 2007, where you had the GHGRP that was passed by Congress. This is the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, and that kicked in around 2010. So it took us 20 years to get to a point where emitters that were smaller than those electric power firms started to need to report at that particular time. That was really the last time that we had major action by Congress, and everything's been moving through the EPA since then. In 2020, we had the omnibus package passed through Congress that included some clean energy tax incentives, and this was just recently. And there's a direction here for EPA to phase down the HCFCs that I mentioned just before with regard to refrigeration, again, over the next 15 years, though. So we're looking out till 2035 in just that space alone. That doesn't mean that, again, from a regulatory perspective, things might change, but this is the dynamic we're playing with. Just this year, we've had a few major proposals that could impact you with regard to carbon and whether these elements that are voluntary right now become mandatory, or at least something that especially your investors are looking for if you're going to get that cash infusion. One of which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, who has just put a proposal together with regard to climate-related disclosures. These do exist already in SEC risk protocols, but now the SEC is starting to say they want to specifically look at this dynamic, and they are now going to enforce some of these perspectives in terms of identifying risks, not just simple statements that we have a climate risk, but what are those risks across your value chain? And investors are starting to look at this very heavily. We're in a very interesting moment right now in 2022. And then for many of you, you've probably heard of the recent SCOTUS decision with the major questions doctrine that came out that found that EPA exceeded its authority under the Clean Air Act and under the perspective of what firms are generating. This has changed by pushing utilities to make system-wide moves away from coal power generation under the Clean Air Act, Section 111D in particular. And here it's been a very interesting space because now we're starting to see this decision really have magnifying effect across other perspectives as well, everything from nuclear power generation to safety concerns that I've been involved in for some time. So it's going to be a very interesting time here over the next few years in this space. All right, next slide. So with all of this said, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And this is one of the reasons I'm so excited to be before you today, is that there's a lot of places we can look to get help. And Duke wants to be one of those spots. We're seeking firms, and I led a class last semester in sustainable business strategy that worked with companies to help them understand their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Different companies are obviously at different phases within this space, and that's okay. We want to be able to help you. Certainly, you can look to consultants, you can look to the state to help in this space, but we have some wonderful master's students at Duke that also can provide some guidance and maybe some strategy as to where you want to go next. We worked with 14 different companies across the globe this past semester to identify these opportunities, and we really want you to be part of that process. We're currently working with ConAgra and Disney, Indeed.com, a investment firm, SJF Ventures, and Wolfspeed, who might be on this very call today, right there in North Carolina. And we'd love to be able to have more connections within the state, because I think there's a local dynamic to this as well. And there's certainly a community perspective that's going into how do we minimize risk and what are those opportunities. So my email is here, and I'd love to be able to talk with you more, certainly, and we'll welcome questions at the end after we hear from Sarah. I'm so excited to hear from her next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. As we mentioned, our next presenter is Sarah Frazier, a sustainability specialist of New Belgium Brewing, located in Asheville, North Carolina. Sarah is a sustainability specialist in New Belgium's East Coast Brewery. As I said, in Asheville, she supports the company's social and environmental programs with a focus on supply chain and material sustainability. She engages brewery co-workers and supply chain partners in making progress towards the company's ambitious energy, water, emissions, and waste reduction goals. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning. Great to be with you all. Jeremy, thank you so much for that great foundational start for us. Um, yeah, the ESI team asked me to be with you today and just share a little bit about our strategy, our perspective, the greenhouse gas accounting tool that we've used, and just sort of walk through our program. And I hope what I share today is helpful for you, no matter where you are in your journey with greenhouse gas accounting. We've been working on this for, I'd say, about 15 or 16 years now. So we've developed a little bit of knowledge around it. So I'm happy to share our perspective. So just, I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe just a slide or two about who New Belgium is, where we got started, what we're all about, why we care about greenhouse gases, and keeping a thorough accounting. And then I'm going to launch into how we go about it and share a tool that we've developed and open sourced. So we are the makers of Fat Tire Amber Ale, as well as a host of other Belgian-inspired and innovative brews. We were founded in 1991 and headquartered in Fort Collins, Colorado. The company was founded by Jeff Liebisch, there on the left, and by Kim Jordan, and we were inspired by a trip that Jeff took around Europe, particularly Belgium, soaking up the beer culture there. He'd been a home brewer for several years, but when he returned home from Belgium with some new ideas and renewed passion, they launched the business from their basement in Fort Collins. And Jeff was an engineer by trade before starting the brewery, so he, in those early days, designed energy capture even into our original basement brew house. Kim, on the other hand, was a social worker before starting the brewery, and so she was always thinking about and putting people first. And Kim and Jeff together established a couple core values and beliefs, as we refer to them, for the business before they even launched and left the basement. And I think having such maybe a strong human-centric approach and having environmental stewardship baked into the DNA of the company, so to speak, from the very beginning, and having such top-down support for this work really enabled us to build the business around our core values and beliefs, including environmental stewardship, and helped us, to start on a path of climate action early on. So why does New Belgium care about climate change and about greenhouse gases and our emissions, and care to, understand, our sources and our impact? To put it quite bluntly, we're fearful for the future of our business, and we are already seeing some pretty significant impacts to the business from climate change. Our water supply in Colorado has been threatened twice by catastrophic wildfires, including the largest wildfire in state history in 2020. It burned 200,000 acres in the canyon of our watershed, just to the northwest of Fort Collins. If you think about it, beer is very much an agricultural product, with barley and hops being two of our next main ingredients behind water. And last year, the barley growing regions that we source from, major barley growing regions for North America, which for us is parts of Montana, Idaho, and a good chunk of Alberta, Canada, that whole area experienced the double whammy of extreme heat and drought. And it really significantly impacted the quality of the grain, to the point that we're struggling right now to source enough barley. Our procurement team is working to find enough for us to make beer this year, and it's compounded by the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, unfortunately, because that happens to be a very important barley growing region for the world. This is not the first time we've seen issues. 2014 and 2017 were both tough years for the barley crop. In those years, portions of the crop were wiped out. In one instance, it was a flash drought at the end of the season, and the other, it was late season rain that caused the barley to actually sprout on the field. So all of those issues impact the availability of the barley, which of course affects the price, but it also impacts the economics of the farmer and the economics of rural regions of the country. But we're realizing that we're seeing more and more erratic weather patterns and harsh seasons that affect agriculture negatively, but they also affect snowpack, rate of snow melt, stream flows, therefore water availability for us. And water, barley, or malt, I should say, and hops are just, they're key ingredients. We cannot make beer without them. Many companies, not just us, are realizing the impacts to their business from unabated climate change are going to be disastrous, and therefore there are a lot of them. Perhaps many of you out there are making some voluntary investments to reduce emissions. Something called the Financial Stability Board created the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures to develop some recommendations on the types of information that companies should disclose to support investors and lenders and insurance underwriters and others to appropriately assess and price, a specific set of risks related to climate change. Our parent company, Kieran, is part of the TCFD and has modeled out a pretty grim picture for us, at least for agricultural related procurement with the worst climate change scenario. So to summarize, regulation in this area is coming, and the sooner that we can all be prepared, the better. So New Belgium, we really began our journey on greenhouse gas accounting solidly in 2008. At that time, we commissioned the first carbon footprint for beer, and we hired an organization called the Climate Conservancy. I don't think they're around anymore, but they did a life cycle analysis for us on a 6-pack of Fat Tire, which is our flagship beer. And that LCA was eye-opening for us. I think at the time we thought distribution, trucking beer and glass bottles around the country would be the biggest hitter, biggest impact. And it's not insignificant, but we really did underestimate the impacts of other categories. For example, our packaging and barley and malt. That graphic on the right shows the components of the various contributors to our greenhouse gas impact. I have a different slide that I'll show in a little more detail, but afterwards, in 2009, we began doing our own greenhouse gas accounting in-house, and we've been doing it ever since. So fast forward to 2020, and we achieved carbon neutral certification for Fat Tire. And certainly our marketing and sales folks saw it as the potential for some brand lift for Fat Tire, and it has indeed, translated into that for Fat Tire. But we really honestly pursued it to elevate the conversation around the importance of climate action and to draw our beer drinkers' attention to this, as well as peers in the industry. We've done a couple other things in this vein, and you can learn more. We have a whole website dedicated to telling the story of Fat Tire's carbon neutral certification and explaining the importance of climate action. It's called drinksustainably.com. This screen, this slide shows our 2030 climate goals. And of course, we've checked off that first one of achieving carbon neutral certification for the first beer in the United States. Our next goal around carbon neutral certification is to actually achieve that for all of our brands by 2030. Our parent company, Kieran, is also committed to a couple other initiatives, one being RE100. So we'll be sourcing 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is, how to describe that? I guess it's sort of a corporate framework for climate action. And so the SBTI commitment cascades down from Kieran to New Belgium. It's not optional, so we are committed to this. We have to do it. And it commits us to reducing our greenhouse gases for scopes 1 and 2 by 55% from a 2019 baseline, and scope 3 by 30% by 2030. The SBTI does not account for growth. So when we model that in the best we can for 2030, that is looking more like a 70% reduction in scopes 1 and 2 and a 50% reduction in scope 3. So that's pretty significant for us, quite ambitious, quite challenging. And I would say we're in conversation with Kieran about it too, and they are also feeling the same, challenge by this, but also committed to it. And I'll just be honest and say that we definitely don't have it all figured out between now and 2030, but we're sort of building the airplane as we fly and figuring it out the best we can. I keep using the term carbon neutral, so I thought I'd take a minute to discuss what that actually means. First of all, in the United States, there are no federal standards for carbon neutral certification, nor are there for carbon offsets, which are a vehicle you use to achieve certification. So you see a number of these different labels and different programs out there. We have chosen to work with SCS Global to achieve carbon neutral certification for Fat Tire. Just interviewing and talking with a few of the different programs, we felt that it had the most rigor and was really kind of holding our feet to the fire, which is important for us. So carbon neutral is really taking a measurement of your greenhouse gases that are emitted across the life cycle of the product that you manufacture, and then making reductions where you can, but ultimately, at least at the point we're at right now, purchasing carbon offsets to sequester or mitigate those emissions that you've emitted. Carbon offsets are sort of like an accounting mechanism, I suppose, balancing the scales on greenhouse gas pollution. So if you're emitting greenhouse gases in your operations over here, because those gases circulate around the atmosphere of the whole planet, in theory, you can invest in a carbon project that sequesters those emissions somewhere else. In theory, it doesn't really matter where that happens. And so that kind of mitigates those emissions that you've created. Net zero is a standard of the Science Based Target Initiative, and in the last IPCC report, the climate scientists, as you all probably know, are telling us that the window to avert the worst effects of climate change is closing faster than anticipated. So against this backdrop, there's a whole lot of companies that are adopting net zero targets now. And so SBTI is creating a standard defining net zero as reducing greenhouse gas emissions to a very minimal level, and therefore reducing the reliance on carbon offsets to achieve a certification. And then real zero, of course, would be just not really emitting any greenhouse gases at all. So there's another slide. I think I have a couple other things that'll fly in here. Just go ahead and fill it out. We achieved carbon neutral certification for Fat Tire, but first of all, let me be clear if I haven't already, that does not mean we no longer emit any greenhouse gases. But what it does mean is that we do this thorough accounting of the sources of those. So this graphic here on the left sort of breaks that down. So Jeremy did a great job explaining scopes 1, 2, and 3. So for us, scope 2 emissions are shown in this blue category down here. I don't think this is totally representative of all of our scope 1 emissions. It certainly isn't. It's just for the sake of having a nice clean graphic. We show like the heavy hitters right here for us. We sort of think of scope 1 as the emissions coming from the 4 walls of the brewery, plus our vehicle fleet as well. Scope 2 are those emissions strictly related to the electricity that we purchase, shown in this pink shade here. And then scope 3 for us is everything in these green shades, things that are happening upstream and downstream of our operations. As you think about doing your own greenhouse gas accounting, or perhaps you already are, I encourage you to include scope 3. If you're not doing it now, that's fine, but I encourage you to think about it, because as you can see, it can represent a significant portion of a company's emissions. Here's just maybe another description or another graphic explaining like how are we achieving carbon neutral certification. We work on making some energy efficiency upgrades at our breweries. We invest in renewable energy. This is just a picture of one of our methane balls. We have some wastewater treatment plants with anaerobic digesters that are producing methane-rich biogas at the breweries, and so we're capturing that and making use of that renewable energy source. We're working with folks in our supply chain, particularly barley growers, to incorporate more climate-friendly and regenerative agriculture growing practices to sequester more carbon in soil. And then with what's left over, we're purchasing carbon offsets to achieve a carbon neutral certification. So after we achieved that certification for Fat Tire, other brewers reached out to us, asking us how we did it, some tips of the trade, how we might, how they might get started. And we realized that we really have developed some sophistication over in this area over the past 15 or 16 so years. And admittedly, as a larger craft brewer in the craft beer industry, we have the luxury of having a few sustainability positions dedicated to, working on this type of stuff. And that isn't always the case at other smaller breweries or other businesses where folks, may be lucky to have an environmental health and safety position or a few, or they may, in the case of a craft brewer, they may be wearing different hats. They may be pouring beer in the tap room one day and cutting payroll the next. So we decided to publish our playbook in the hopes that we would be able to inspire others and give them the tools to take action. And we've called it a carbon neutral toolkit. It certainly is not all about achieving a carbon neutral certification. There's a whole lot of information there just on understanding how to assess your greenhouse gas impact and then what you might do with that in terms of maybe setting some goals. So you can download this from our Drink Sustainably website. When you do download it, you'll find 2 files in there. One is a PDF offering some info and tips on measuring your carbon footprint, setting a carbon neutral goal if you choose to, making some reductions in your emissions, and then there's also some info on pursuing a carbon neutral certification and sort of some watch outs for that and for purchasing carbon offsets if you choose to. The other file in the download is an Excel file that we call a greenhouse gas accounting tool. And I'm actually going to toggle over to that and step through it. So hopefully you can all see my Excel spreadsheet now, and hopefully it's somewhat legible at this scale.
We can see it.
Great. Okay, good. So yeah, this is the tool that we honestly have been using and developing since 2009. We've added over to it over the years, but we are using Jeremy mentioned that there's a couple different protocols out there. We are using the World Resource Institute's greenhouse gas protocol with some sector-specific guidance for the craft beer industry, or I should say for the beverage industry layered on top of that. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of tabs across the bottom. I'm going to go through some of these. I won't bore you with walking through each one of them, but just to give you a little bit of a walkthrough, this is the welcome page. It's obviously going to offer some information on what color codings mean, where you're going to be inputting data, some information further down about steps for using the template. It's taken us, as I mentioned, over a decade to build this out and create this. It's designed to the best of our ability and our understanding. This is version 1 that we've released to the world for other folks to use. And we'll strive to fix any errors or challenges that arise as folks use it. Let's see, moving across, obviously there's going to be a self-explanatory tab for some frequently asked questions and glossary of commonly used terminology. There's a series of red tabs here across the bottom, and these are going to be some reports that are going to be dynamically created as you input data. We, just for the sake of having some examples, have thrown in some information in here to get started so you can kind of see how it's going to look. But we've tried hard to make this thing streamlined and straightforward as we open source it, but there's absolutely no denying it's going to take a little bit of effort to establish a greenhouse gas baseline. Depending on how much data you have at your fingertips already, the process of gathering data from utility bills, raw material purchases, sales, et cetera, could take a little bit of time. Definitely the first year is going to require the most amount of effort. If you open that PDF file that I mentioned from the download, you'll see, and there's a section about measuring your footprint, and you'll see that we note that we estimate it might take as much as 300 hours over a period of 6 months for your first go around to build your greenhouse gas inventory, but certainly future assessments are going to be a whole lot more efficient than that first time. I definitely suggest as you go that you make notes in whatever tool that you're using about where you're sourcing that data from. That way it's repeatable, so the next time you open it up and you go about this exercise, or if you're sharing that responsibility with others, you kind of have this information of like, where do you go to find out where's your electricity information and so forth, or what departments are you going to contact to sort some of that out. It could be a great project for an intern, and also in that PDF document we note some universities that have some really great environmental programs, greenhouse gas accounting programs, where you might source some interns. Duke University, another plug for them, is one of those that we list. Certainly you could hire a consultant to do this work, which would cost more money but might speed up the process for you. But anyway, to talk through this a little bit more, obviously I'm going to move over to some of these blue tabs. Obviously, this is geared for beer. We make beer and that's what we know, so it's built for that. But our hope is that potentially this is adaptable or customizable for other businesses. And you could plug in your own information and sort of make it use for it for your own uses. So these, just to talk through a few of these, the blue tabs are going to be scopes 1 and 2, but this very first one we call control data. So we measure beer, the beer that we produce, in hectoliters and barrels. So hence the reason you see these HL and BBL. We have this tool set up as if you had 2 facilities, which we do. So we have a main facility and a secondary one. Obviously, if you had more facilities, you could add, more or drop it down to a single one if that were the case for your setup. What else? I'm going to move across to electricity. So here is where you would enter monthly electricity usage and kilowatt hours from your utility bills. That's where we're sourcing our data from. The template, pretty self-explanatory, is set up for 5 meters, but you could adapt that for your own purposes. You would want to come down here, and we've got a link for you to come over and find the specific emission factors for your utility via an eGrid link. So if you're not familiar with eGrid, this is a tool published by the EPA that provides an average emission factor for the United States broken down into subregions. If you can get better or more accurate data specifically from your utility, that would be best, the best way to go. Moving over to the right, likewise, natural gas is going to be very similar to electricity in that you're entering consumption on a monthly basis from utility bills and the unit of therms or whatever unit you're recorded in. What else? At New Belgium, we have our own wastewater treatment plants, as I mentioned, and so we have some emissions related to flaring operations. Obviously, you would skip over this if you don't have those operations or equipment. We also have a tab here for fugitive emissions related to HVAC and chilling. Chilling beer is a significant portion of our operations, an important piece of making beer. But anyway, we've got some standard refrigerants, at least for the brewing industry, entered in here. So you see our 407C here. There's a couple different ones. I don't know how common these are outside the brewing industry, but of course we've got a placeholder here for, a refrigerant that you might plug in. You would want to, and I'm pretty sure we have it down here at the bottom, come down here and find the specific global warming potential for any refrigerant that you would plug in or that you would, change. Likewise, manufacturing waste. If you are a manufacturing facility, this is probably one that you would want to step through and record this sort of information in. Similarly, a vehicle fleet, if you have a fleet, that's also included in Scope 1 emissions, and you would want to account for those emissions related to to your vehicles. And then what else? We also record emissions related to corporate air travel. For us, it's not very significant, but it's something that we do track and keep tabs on. There are a lot of tabs here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but moving over, the next color over here is going to be these orange tabs. And so we're moving into, the orange ones are labeled as upstream. So these are going to be part of Scope 3 emissions. And these are things, as we refer to it, happening upstream of the brewery, upstream of our operations. So for us, that's things like the cultivation and harvesting of the barley, emissions related to that, the transportation of the barley to a malting facility, the emissions related to the energy consumed in the malting process, and then the transportation of the malt to the brewery. Likewise, the emissions related to the manufacturing of our packaging, like glass bottles, aluminum cans, fiber packaging, and so forth. Clearly, if you adapted this tool, you'd want to make, changes to whatever those upstream emissions might be and upstream sources for you. Likewise, downstream for us, we are measuring the emissions related to trucking the beer, distribution, trucking the beer away from the brewery to distributors and ultimately to retail outlets. We also track the refrigeration of the beer in the retail outlet and even the refrigeration in the consumer's home. So we take it pretty far down the line. Also in this tool, there's some reference information in case that's helpful for you. We also track, we're not required to report and account for, even in our carbon neutral certification, things that represent less than 1% of our total carbon footprint, but we do make note of what those things are, and each year check in on them to make sure that they're not moving into something greater than 1%. And then just another tab on greenhouse gas protocol scopes and definitions. Let's see, I'm gonna toggle back to presentation for a second. Let me make sure I get to the right one, and bear with me. Here we go. Let's see. Sorry, I had a couple of slides in there. Let me get back up. And then I'm gonna close it out here shortly. I just wanted to maybe end with saying, it's great. It's the first step and important step is understanding the source of your emissions through this, this accounting work. But for what it's worth, I thought I'd share what comes next for us. And this slide represents the various work streams that we have happening internally to help us meet those 2030 goals and commitments. So starting over here on the left, we have established our own internal carbon neutral task force that's composed of members from a couple different departments, engineering, operations, and so forth. They're specifically working on emissions reductions for scope 1 and 2, including such things as achieving that 100% renewable electricity by 2030 goal, incorporating more energy efficiency at the breweries, addressing refrigerants, and greening our fleet. Moving to the right, this next column is something we're calling our Sustainable Supplier Program, and that is specifically focused on making emissions reductions in scope 3. As you can imagine, the further away from your own operations and your own control, when you get upstream and downstream, the harder it is to make any sort of, have leverage and have control about making those emissions reductions. So it is definitely a partnership of working with our suppliers and others in our supply chain to, for example, work on increasing recycled content in our packaging. For us, working with barley growers and our malt suppliers to encourage them to adopt more sustainable and climate-friendly and climate-resilient growing practices. This central work stream is we're just related to achieving carbon neutral certification, which is its own sort of piece of work in of itself. My team, and I work in the sustainability department at New Belgium, is sort of the curator of this work, but it's also done in tandem with our marketing team, who also sees, I think, as I mentioned, some value for Fat Tire. We also have a smaller brand called Mountain Time that's also achieved that certification. And then moving over to the right, we have a program at New Belgium called dollar per barrel. So for every barrel of beer that we produce, we set aside $1 that goes into a bucket for philanthropy. We dedicate a portion of that philanthropy budget to investing in this work. So a great example is for several years now, we've provided some grants to a barley breeding lab at Montana State University that's developing and working with growers on developing some more climate resilient and climate friendly varieties of barley. And then finally, policy advocacy is, we realize that we can move towards our goals faster, more efficiently, more cost effectively when we have policy pushing or incentivizing change. So we partner with a couple organizations, BICEP, America's All In, that bring together a whole bunch of businesses and other companies that are advocating for responsible climate and energy legislation and policy at local, state, and federal levels. I think that's the last of my slides. I think I failed to mention, I think it's important maybe to explain at New Belgium, all of that greenhouse gas accounting work is done for us primarily by one individual, and he sits in the environmental health and safety department. He's been doing it since at least 2010. I'm not sure exactly why it landed on his plate, but he is definitely a whiz with Excel. He also has a passion for the work. And generally, he commences it towards the back half of February. That way it's allowed the prior year plenty of time to close out. And it usually takes, I think, on average, something like 30 to 40 hours of work to complete it at this point for him. We've been doing this for several years, so he's kind of got that, he's got it down. But the goal for us is always to have it wrapped up by the end of Q1. That just happens to be our timeline for when we're doing it. But in any event, I will wrap up and be happy to take some questions. And I just, in closing, say focus on progress over perfection. And certainly if you're getting started on this, you're going to develop a skill set, you'll develop a fluency with the terminology and a process for doing it internally. And yeah, that's all I've got. Thank you.
All right, very good. Hey, I'm Terry Albrecht, and I'm going to help facilitate some questions. So I want to invite our over 100 attendees to type in your questions, and I want to invite also our panelists to be, yes, cams on, and you can be unmuted for this. So first, thank you for a great foundational overview, and then Sarah for sharing that journey. So right now, we're going to address some questions, and I'm just going to kind of go round robin on these. And yeah, so Sarah, I think this first one's for you. Do you have any idea on how much the brewery's CO2 footprint comes from the CO2 byproduct from fermentation? And did the LCA study calculate that?
It is, I don't know if the LCA study back in 2008 calculated it. It is pretty insignificant for us, and it's considered a biogenic source of CO2, so it's not something we're required to account for. But it's there. It's just relative to all the other sources, it's rather insignificant for us.
All right, great. So the next question, could the presenter recommend a certification for individuals that want to achieve? Could you make a certification recommendation for folks that are trying to achieve or looking for, like, what recommendations would you, or certification recommendations might you have for different products, I think is the question, if I can rephrase that. And Jeremy or Sarah, if you'd like to jump in on that would be great.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it first. We've been using, we work with SCS Global as our certifier. We found them to be quite professional, to have a lot of experience in a variety of different certifications, not just carbon neutral. The way it works with SCS is we compile our own greenhouse gas accounting. We hand that off to them. They review it, run it through their own models. And they also send it to a third-party certifier that sort of verifies, we all are agreeing on the methods that we've used to calculate the emissions. And then they come back to us with a final, total emission. Now, let me back up and say, we're following a standard called the PAS 2060, which is developed by the British Standards Institute. And that is a product level certification. So hence the reason I'm saying that we certified Fat Tire and not New Belgium as a whole. We realize that encompassing all of our emissions for the entire operations of the brewery would be quite a lot for us to bite off. And so we started, product by product, brand by brand. The other thing that we've liked about that standard and the certification, the work with SCS, is that it requires us to make annual emissions reductions each year. So if we have a year where our emissions actually increase a little bit, we're going to lose that certification. That's tough and challenging for us, especially since we're, it's a good problem to have, but we're experiencing some growth right now. But that can prove challenging. But it also is important because it requires us to reduce our reliance on offsetting over time. So I hope I answered the question, Terry.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think
Okay.
that was really helpful. Jeremy, anything to add there? Any other
Yeah,
suggestions?
so there's different groups like the Carbon Trust that will do some of this work. Certainly, also as an individual to be able to do this really well, there's many, many resources out there that folks can look to. I know that I believe it's the Association of Energy Engineers, AEE, does a certification in this space as well. Again, not for your individuals, but to get you to the point where you can feel really comfortable passing the buck on to somebody who's doing this, which I think is really a common problem for many, even for our students at Duke and anywhere I've been teaching, to be able to understand and make sure you feel comfortable passing it on to an accounting is huge. Not all firms certify, but those that do have a lot more trust in the data and what's taking place in that particular space. So there's some options there, certainly for getting certified as well as having your data certified also.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so this next question I think will first be for Sarah. And so it's a question of whether you all are using fossil energy and do you have essentially an electrification plan for that. And then as a follow-up to that, there's some questions about fleet and that electrification. So maybe we'll throw that out.
Yes, yes, we are still consuming fossil energy. For example, the electricity we purchase, we're on at least in Asheville, we're on the Duke grid. So that is one of the reasons that we really, spend a lot of time advocating. For example, in Fort Collins, it's out there, the utility is a municipally owned utility. And we were not the only one, but there's a lot of businesses and others in that community that advocated for the utility to adopt a renewable electricity goal. And so in Fort Collins, the utility out there is on a path to renewable energy by 2030, which is going to benefit New Belgium, but also a whole bunch of other businesses that are, wanting to make these reductions. But as far as fleet, yes, if you're in the fleet world or you know anything about like the status of trying to obtain electric vehicles is kind of tough now with supply chains as they are. We are a large craft brewer, but when it comes to fleet and, we're still kind of a small fish. And so, negotiating some contracts for some of those vehicles is proving tougher. So yeah, we're exploring some different options. One of our biggest sources of emissions in our fleet, I guess, is those of the big haul trucks that go across country. And there's a lot of challenges. I think right now there's a lot of electrification happening in maybe the last mile trucking, where those vehicles, those trucks make deliveries during the day and then return to the warehouse or a central place where they get charged up overnight. So those are some of the ones that are being electrified first. The over-the-road long haul trucks are not there yet. There's not the charging infrastructure. There's also the challenge, as I understand it, and I probably know just enough to be dangerous and maybe muck this up. I hope I'm not. But as I understand it, those batteries are so heavy, and that presents some challenges to those trucks. One, in that when they become so heavy, they reduce the amount of payload that they can actually haul. And it puts a strain on, the roads and bridges and infrastructure out there. So there's that concern. But they just literally do not exist quite yet. So.
And as far as a timeline, do you have a more specific timeline beyond the larger
2030.
production? 2030. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, that's what we're working towards. I guess it gets a little more nuanced at like that carbon neutral task force level. They've got, some smaller little milestones and goals that they're setting, but I don't have that information at my fingertips to share right now. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great, very good. Hey, so this next question is also for Sarah. And so with everything you've presented today, what would be your number one recommendation for a significant, an activity for a significant greenhouse gas reduction in brewing?
In brewing, I would say,
Your
we
number
always say
one.
like, the number one, gosh, where to start? Wherever you can capture waste heat and waste energy, I think is going to be probably best. I mean, we always start with efficiency before we invest in any sort of renewable energy. I think we always say, and maybe this is not a saying we coined, but the cheapest watt is the one you never have to purchase. So wherever you can make those savings, do that. If they're in the brewing industry, I would say there's some great resources out there through the Brewers Association. The Sustainability Subcommittee I think they've got a series of manuals on efficiency upgrades. So I definitely think and it also depends. Like we have larger equipment than a lot of smaller craft brewers, but I would say waste heat is a big one where you can capture that and make use of it. We've got a number of heat exchangers throughout the brewery, and those save us quite a bit.
Great. That's super feedback. Next question will be a question on the frequency that you're reviewing those upstream and downstream impacts, those life cycles. So I think that's a general question, like how often do you go back and look at that? You've established that. I think that's another Sarah question.
Yeah, we're just doing that once a year. So each year we go through our greenhouse gas accounting. We go through this exercise of tallying up, what are all the sources of emissions, and so it's really just once a year. It is time consuming, and it really, I'm not sure it changes a whole lot from say month to month. Certainly, like in an agricultural operation, I think there's going to be fluctuations season to season, but we don't have the bandwidth, on our team to like be looking at that on that sort of, any sort of greater frequency.
And a follow-up to that are your suppliers and vendors reporting back to you? And they were talking about this January, February timeframe. So like how is that inputted into that re-review?
Yeah, that is a great question, and something we're working on right now. Is we've that I mentioned on, I was at that last slide where I showed sort of our different work streams that we're working on, and we've got this thing we call the Sustainable Supplier Program. It's in a pilot phase right now, so we've engaged with, gosh, a half dozen suppliers that represent the most material impact to our greenhouse gas footprint, and are also like material spend for us. And we've made this. As I mentioned, we're a bigger craft brewer, but we're still like 0.04% of all the beer consumed in the United States. So when it comes to working with some of these larger suppliers who also have like global footprints, we're still a very small customer. So we don't have a lot of weight to throw around. So it's a conversation and an ask. We're wielding a carrot, not a stick, and saying, hey, listen, this is important to us. This is affecting our business right now. We're really concerned for the future. We'd really like your help on making these emissions reductions. Here's some ideas of goals we have for you. And then the follow-up is, yes, we're going to need accurate data from you too, to be able to actually demonstrate some reductions and to demonstrate for, our SBTI commitment as well as our carbon neutral certification, to understand like how changes are happening on an annual basis for them. So we're in the process of figuring out that reporting scheme right now. There are some reporting schemes that companies do report through, like really large companies like Carbon Disclosure Project. Jeremy, you may know more about some of these. There's some other platforms like EcoVadis. I don't know how much it captures, carbon emissions, but there are some things out there that, big companies are reporting through, certainly. But we're trying to figure out we also don't want a total company's emissions. That's not helpful for us. What we want to understand is what does a supplier's emissions for the facility that supplies our brewery, what do those look like? So that's going to be what's really accurate information when it comes to our accounting. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to say we haven't figured it out yet, but that's the next nut we're trying to crack, is how do we develop something that's also streamlined and easy. We don't want to be, a pain to our suppliers. And they're getting asked this more and more from a lot of different places. So we're trying to make it streamlined and straightforward and not a heavy lift for them as well.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks, Sarah. Jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I was just, she nailed it. And I think thinking about the Carbon Disclosure Project is a great one that's very accessible online. The Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, is another one that I've worked with for many, many years at this point, and is, again, publicly available on that end to be thinking about some of these questions. Carbon Disclosure Project can be a little more difficult to navigate at times, depending on what you're trying to identify. But Sarah, even if you look at Sarah's data, which is typical of every single firm, I would offer, is that your scope 1 and 2 are the smaller parts of your emissions. So your scope 3 becomes a really important element. And I mentioned early on the investment perspective. If you want investment in your firm, understanding that materiality, which is a term of art that is becoming really widely understood. And so taking that from today's hour is a really great element of understanding materiality in terms of how elements within your life cycle, and Sarah mentioned life cycle early on, are impacting or having an impact on your emissions is really critical. And that materiality then allows you to say, hey, I'll have 1 or 2 projects that we could work on. And these are the types of things actually we're working on in our Duke classroom, is trying to understand. Oftentimes a firm like Wolfspeed that I mentioned earlier understands scope 1 and 2 and many of their scope 3 emissions, but strategically, how do I reduce that number, which is ultimately the goal in many of these environments. And Sarah's spoken to that a lot, but it's hard because there's a lot of different demands on people's time. One question, Sarah, if I may, of you, I know Terry's taking the questions, but are you helping some firms through, and I may already know this answer, but are you helping some firms through allowing them to get you some of this data?
Yeah, we are working with a consultant on trying to figure out, maybe do we develop our own reporting tool that we hand out there to folks and say, super streamline, a handful of small questions. What we want to know is a company or supplier's scope 1 and 2 emissions, which become our scope 3 emissions. So that's essentially what we're trying to get at. So we want to make it easy for them to tell us, how many kilowatt hours. We're trying to figure out, do we ask them, like, how many kilowatt hours did you, consume in a calendar year or whatever, fiscal year, whatever it may be. And then we do the back end calculation of figuring out what the emissions factor is for that. That would be, like, an easy, instead of just saying, hey, what were your emissions? Let's help them by doing some of the calculations too. The other piece of that is we have to also understand what percentage of a supplier's business would be, and therefore the emissions would be allocated to us. That is somewhat sensitive data that suppliers, I can relate, I can understand, like, they don't necessarily want to disclose that to a customer, because that potentially could give you some leveraging, or give you a little bit of power when it comes to negotiations. So I think we're ultimately going to work with some sort of exterior entity to have a neutral space where they can report that information that is obscured from us, and we just get some derived data to say, like, emissions related to bottles for Fat Tire were X. I'm just making something up,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the competitive landscape too that we all are part of in this space. And that, I think, is the fascinating dynamic. But it's that scope 3 perspective in particular. That's going to be the focus of, I think, many webinars to come, because trying to figure out how we collect that data, are able to use it in a useful fashion. And the larger we get, the more difficult that tends to get. So the material, and you mentioned that 1% negligible perspective to get to net zero. Boy, oh boy, you're talking about a lot of pieces to that puzzle. And other people are worried about double counting as well. But I think that's less of a worry at this particular point in time.
Great discussion here. And like you said, like, this is a topic for many more webinars, and hopefully we can address some more of these in our series as we roll that out. Jeremy, the next question is for you. We've got a question for you to explain a little bit more about how your Duke students could be assisting facilities in maybe the beginning of this journey. Like, are they interns? Is this project-based? How might this work? And then maybe those first couple of steps on what you have suggestions for facilities that are maybe just having a requirement for for reporting at the site level and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a bit of a range of opportunities that Duke has right now, and the program's only been around doing this type of work for about 4 years at this point. So we're still getting our feet wet a little bit. At the same time, the beauty of this is that we can start in the classroom introducing topics with these students. They're all master's level students, all have to have a few years of experience in the field as well. So we're not coming in completely green behind the ears, if you will. After that introductory semester where they're taking classes, in our second semester, they take a course with me on business strategy and sustainability. And there we work with projects depending on, and we ask firms for a problem statement. Where am I at? That can be at the very beginning with, I just need to know, my problem is I don't understand my carbon emissions, or I don't understand my greenhouse gas emissions. And then we will and then like this last year, we had those 14, 15, we had a few more projects. We had about 20 projects. We couldn't get to all of them this past year, although there is a process for that as well. I'll mention in a minute. And within those projects, students then can pick, depending on expertise. And this year, it worked out really nicely where each of those companies had 2 or 3 students that had different perspectives, again, acted as a stakeholder, which is much of our discussion today, to the firm to add value strategically as to where the firm should go next. In some cases, with one particular firm, they looked at a number of ESG platforms because they did understand this, but now they wanted to know how can they start to collect the data more efficiently. So there's a lot of different opportunities that our students can look at. No problem is too big or small, I would say. And I have to tell you, it was amazing to watch. Some people literally change their strategy as a result of the student work in this classroom. I've never seen that happen before. And so it's really, we're getting to a much more mature space with our students as well as the firms. So that's part of this. In terms of, Terry, your second question, and actually I want to answer one other piece first, is that after we work with these firms, we then oftentimes get requests to help work through the summer. And so there can be internships that are then provided at that point in time. Deke is also doing internships in different spaces, and that's a discussion we're having with Terry as well to help partner and to understand what these problems are, because we have these students that are excited about this work. This work you're in the business and environmental space, is one of the largest growing schools in all of Duke University. So there is a lot of focus in this particular space right now. Again, as I mentioned, sometimes this can flow into some internship work. So I'm working with some folks this summer that have carried over. And then lastly, you potentially could jump it into a full master's project that would work with you over the course of a full year. So we have a real broad spectrum of opportunity for you to be able to work with these students. The other thing I love about it is that we don't want to, if Duke doesn't have that expertise, we will also look to North Carolina State. We will look to UNC, amongst other schools, to be able to have this. I know I mentioned to Sarah when I was out visiting her a few months back that there's some schools out that way that if they're closer to home, we'd love to have a bit of boots on the ground as well to help and make this something that's, again, very value added for your organization. Yeah, Terry, I know there was a second part to that question. I think I just talked myself right out of the.
I think there's a general question that's just saying, who should be involved in the start of that? Like, do you have recommendations on pulling together staff and who should be involved in that at the organization level, especially if, this is kind of coming corporate down, the site's reacting to it, and, what are those first couple of steps?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, there's a lot of project management in this as well from a management perspective. So I would offer up that typically your firm, if it's larger, might already have a charter type system from a project management perspective. Trying to work within the system, I've come to find, helps immensely. I'm working with a firm right now that's very systematic in the way they look at things, a Canadian-based firm, and they really want to have the dots, the I's dotted, the T's crossed, if you will. If you're a little bit smaller and you can make this work, it's a similar process where even if it's just jotting down on paper, who are the key stakeholders in allowing you to get the data you need? Typically maintenance is a big part of that, or facilities, hugely important. I know Sarah mentioned them a little bit earlier as part of their process. Operations management, anything that has an impact on those scope 1 or 2 dynamics really can be hugely helpful. If your firm is in the middle, having a team of 4 to 8 people is probably going to be your best mix. But frankly, if you can have all those stakeholders there, you're not, and finances, the financial piece is a huge part of this to make sure that a part of this, because not only you don't want to collect this data, but you're going to want to get people excited about the fact that you can do something with it. And I think that's a really big, important factor in this space is we're moving out of that. Let's just not collect the data, but also how can we work with it that then more people will want to be part of your team when that happens.
Great. Sarah, anything to add to the second part of that question?
Yeah, I think I would also say just identifying a few champions that are passionate about this. They're in your company, I guarantee it. And finding who those folks are and then empowering them, also like recognizing they have other job duties, and this might be at least in the initial stages something of a volunteer or pet project. But if you can work with, if they're not a manager, you can work with their manager to say, hey, how can we make this part of, your department person's, job responsibilities. That would be wonderful, and to explain how that could be a win. But yeah, I would say identify those champions and start to cultivate them in this realm.
Yeah, Sarah, that's so very important. And not only that, but how can they add value to that committee and to their department? If you can identify that early as part of that stakeholder process, we've come to find that the firms will let those people go because they're able, that hour or so that might be difficult to give up will prove fruitful for that organization as well. Hugely important, we're coming to find. And it doesn't have to be big. It can be some small dynamics that when those managers can see that, we're seeing some real results.
Super. Great responses and great suggestions for those kind of in the early phases of this journey. So our next question is for Sarah. One of our registrants noticed that the glass was one of your biggest GHG issues, and there was a general question about where folks could learn more about decarbonization in the glass industry, and also kind of ditto for aluminum on 2 of your product packaging pieces. So I don't know if you have suggestions back for them.
Yeah, I'm going to try not to go too deep on a tangent here because it's something we're pretty passionate about and have kind of dived deep on. To start by answering the question on glass, check out Glass Recycling Coalition. I think it's glassrecycles.org. Is that right? If you do the web search, it'll come up. But that's an organization that New Belgium co-founded to help address the emissions in glass. And I'm going to first start out, I'd like to dispel the myth that, yes, astute attendees seeing that glass represents a big emission for us. But I'd like to dispel any sort of perception that glass, or that I should say aluminum, is a more sustainable packaging type. And let me just explain why. It seems, that glass being the heavier of the 2 containers, there's going to be a lot more, heavier trucks, more emissions related to trucking glass around the country. But if you look at the full life cycle of those 2 containers, aluminum, the raw materials for glass is essentially sand. It has a big emission related to it because it takes huge furnaces to melt that down and create glass bottles out of it. We founded the Glass Recycling Coalition because the recycling rates for glass are not very high in this country, and the more recycled content we can get into glass, it really drives down that emission. That's a whole nother topic of like why recycling happens at a municipal level and not at some sort of like state level or federal level. Anyway, that's a topic for another webinar. But if you look at the entire life cycle of aluminum, the raw material for aluminum is something called bauxite, and the mining and smelting of bauxite is one of the most biologically destructive processes on the planet. So we don't necessarily think aluminum is a clear winner. The best container is the one that actually gets recycled and reused, or reused would actually be better than recycled. But aluminum does have, across the country in general, greater recycling rates. But I think we see some great value, or I think great potential, I should say, and the potential for, what happens in other countries is that people return and reuse glass bottles. There's some great models around the world for this. And so there's some interesting organizations. One is Loop out there, which is an offshoot of TerraCycle that is developing reusable containers, not just for glass, but all sorts of consumer products. And they've got a couple pilots running in some retail outlets. But yeah, sorry, Terry, I went off on a tangent. I knew I would, but yeah, there's a lot of people drinking beer, a lot of things out of aluminum these days, and that's great. And aluminum's a great container, but I think glass gets a bad rap that doesn't necessarily deserve. I think the other thing about aluminum is that often, because it's such an energy intensive process to create those aluminum containers and to smelt the ore into aluminum, they're located on hydrogrids, so they don't show up with as much of a energy intensity, whereas glass does because it's on traditional fossil powered grids. I'll stop
Yes,
talking
it's
now.
like it's like a Pandora's box as you dig
Yeah.
in and look at all the nuances and try to make those comparisons. So I do appreciate that. We have just a few minutes left for just a couple more questions. We are scheduled to end at 11:30, and we've had two questions regarding certifications. And so this is a question like, if you are an EHS professional, is there a suggested certification that you could get that would kind of encompass greenhouse gas reporting, or even ESG duties as an EHS professional looking for some sort of certifications? We'll start with you, Jeremy. Any suggestions there? Is there anything out there so far?
There are a number of them, absolutely. And just a quick clarification too, to earlier before I mentioned the Carbon Trust. Those types of firms will actually certify products, versus Sarah, I think, was alluding to who's certifying her reports. And there's a bunch of different firms out there that'll do that as well. I was just working with one firm, LRQA is the accounting firm, but they're typically accounting firms that'll actually certify, but your products can also be certified as well. Sarah, do you use a different firm to actually certify like your fat tire?
No, I don't believe we do. We're really strictly working on just the carbon neutral one with SES.
Okay, perfect, great. No, and that's fine, and that's typical, and you don't have to. I think that's really the element that I'd like to impart here, is that as we move through this process, it's something that oftentimes is really very much done at a local level. In terms of certifications, I mentioned AEE before. That's an engineering group that will give you very specifics on how to understand the carbon dynamic and the carbon accounting in particular. I mentioned them because I have a certification that I've been working on with those folks, and it's, again, very technical. But at the same time, I think you can also get certified through many universities. Local universities and colleges are starting to have these. I just saw one. Again, I'm up in Maine. We don't have one in our state, but the University of New Hampshire has one. They're serving as kind of a local bastion for these types of issues. In North Carolina, Duke does have some projects here. I could share some of these with you, Terry, maybe afterward, so that folks can get a clearer idea of where those are at.
Great. And I do want to restate that we will be sharing links to Sarah's resources, both the tool and the spreadsheet, in a follow-up email. And we can try to put other resources in that email as well, just to capture, because we've certainly had lots of questions there. Okay, Sarah, one kind of specific question, and this is regarding your RE100 goal. So maybe you could restate that for the audience. But have you mapped out a percentage goal for sourcing and on-site generation specifically? So you've got like a target in both of those categories regarding that RE goal, if that resonates?
Yeah, so the RE goal for us is sourcing 100% renewable electricity by 2030. I don't know if we publicized this yet, but we just put a bunch of solar panels on top of the brewery in Asheville. I think it's probably going to come out to be about 11% of that facility's energy consumption. We are in a tricky place of being so busy that we can't shut down for the 8 hours we need to connect them and get them up and running. So I think we've been a little bit mum on that. So I'm not sure I should be I'm authorized to share that out, but anyway, there it is. But to answer your question about that was sort of the first step, is to like put some on-site, electricity on. I gotta admit, I am working more in the scope 3 realm and less so on scopes 1 and 2. And so I don't know, maybe the smaller, between now and 2030, what those smaller goals are for us and what the breakdown is. But certainly so having some on-site was, a step for us too. We also, I mentioned we've got our own wastewater treatment plants at the breweries. The one in Asheville, our whole brewery in Asheville is relatively young. It's only 6 years old. And so we have this anaerobic digester that's producing biogas. And so we're in this phase of sort of quantifying and qualifying what kind of gas output it has. But one of our next steps would be to try to make use of that biogas. And I don't know if at our Fort Collins brewery, we store it in that methane bubble that I showed in one of those pictures. And we actually, during peak demand on the grid, fire up a CHP and, help power the brewery with that. So it's logistically a little challenging at our Asheville brewery because we, one, don't have the space to store the biogas on site. We have a compact amount of acreage, and then the infrastructure in the brewery is a far piece from actually where the biogas is being generated. So we're trying to figure that out as we speak. I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope I spoke to it a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, we are just about out of time. I might ask if our speakers would be willing to address some additional questions that are lingering out there, and we can send them out to our attendees as feedback. But we want to let everyone know we'll be sending links to all registrants on both recordings and these other resource tools. So with that, maybe you could share our last slide, Dawn. And I just want to say thank you so much to both Jeremy and Sarah for sharing this journey, sharing such great resource information. There's so many folks out there that I think are seeing requirements come down. They have existing requirements. They're trying to navigate that process. And this was, I think, super helpful. This is the first in a series through the Environmental Stewardship Initiative. So look for more webinars on this topic with more details, roadmaps to implementation, specific programs, that companies are doing to make these steps. So watch for these in the future. As you exit this webinar, there will be a survey. So please fill that out, put in your additional questions that we could address for topics in future webinars. And so with that, I want to say a huge thank you to all our attendees and panelists today. And it was a great webinar, and I hope everyone is taking home some valuable information. Thank you all.